Linda sat alone by the window of her modest apartment, watching raindrops snake down the glass like silent tears. It had been months since Jonathan left her, 16 years of marriage unraveled by a single quiet conversation at the dinner table. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't blamed. He simply looked at her with eyes no longer warm and said, "I think it's time we stopped trying." The pain in that sentence was deeper than any cruel word. It wasn't just about trying to have a child. It was about trying to be a family, trying to stay in love, trying to find hope where disappointment had taken root. Linda had miscarried 3 times. She had endured countless nights in sterile hospital rooms, clinging to the sound of faint heartbeats only to hear silence days later. Her arms ached to hold a child that never came. And slowly, piece by piece, she watched the man she loved grow distant, as if each failed pregnancy took not only a part of her but a part of him too. After the divorce, silence became her closest companion. She returned to an empty bed, to rooms once filled with plans and baby names that now echoed with the ghosts of what could have been. Her body was tired, her spirit broken. Even the plants she used to nurture so lovingly had begun to wither, perhaps mirroring the slow decay within her. Friends had tried to offer words of comfort. "You're still young. Maybe adoption. God has a plan." But Linda had heard them all before, and each phrase felt like a dull blade twisting the wound. She no longer smiled the way she used to. Her laughter, once full and bright, had grown cautious, like a guest unsure if it was still welcome in her life. There were days she didn't speak at all. She moved like a ghost through her apartment, doing laundry, cooking meals she barely touched, and folding the same shirts with a robotic sense of order, as if structure could somehow replace meaning. And yet, beneath the grief and numbness, a small ember refused to die. She didn't know it yet. She couldn't feel it. But it was there. It flickered quietly, like a heartbeat waiting to be found again. That ember would one day become the fire that lit her way forward. But for now, Linda remained in the dark, numb, tired, and utterly alone, with nothing but shattered dreams and the steady rhythm of falling rain. Linda hadn't planned to go to the shelter that day. She had signed up to volunteer months ago, back when she still believed keeping busy might distract her from the ache inside. But most mornings, she woke up too tired to pretend. That Tuesday, though, something pulled her out of bed. She didn't know what, only that the silence in her apartment had begun to feel suffocating, and maybe being around children, even if they weren't hers, might momentarily silence the emptiness echoing in her chest. The Child Welfare Center was a small building tucked behind a row of overgrown hedges and faded murals. Inside, laughter and wails collided in chaotic symphony, the sound of dozens of young lives trying to make sense of a world that had already failed them. Linda walked in with a polite smile, trying not to flinch at the mess of toys, the smell of powdered milk and disinfectant, and the way every child's eyes followed her with cautious hope. That's when she saw them. 5 boys sitting in a row on a worn-out mat, all under 10, their clothes mismatched, shoes scuffed, hair in need of trimming. Their eyes, so wide, so quiet, pierced through her. They didn't speak. They didn't reach out. They just looked at her, as if trying to measure whether she was yet another person who'd walk away. A social worker passed behind her and whispered, "They're brothers. Lost both parents in a house fire. No relatives willing to take all 5. Too much responsibility. They're what we call a package deal no one wants." Those words hit Linda harder than she expected. Her breath caught in her throat. No one wants. She knew that feeling too well. The ache of being seen as too much, too complicated, too broken. She looked back at the boys and in them saw her own reflection, rejected, grieving, waiting for someone to choose them anyway. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of those 5 small faces haunted her, followed her into her dreams, lingered with her coffee. She thought about how long she had begged the universe for a chance to be a mother. And now, here it was. Not wrapped in pastel baby clothes or perfect timing, but raw and real and terrifying. She had no husband, no fancy job. Just a small house, a weary heart, and the kind of love that refused to die, even when everything else had. She stood in her kitchen at dawn, staring out the window as the sky turned pale gold, and whispered to herself, "If no one wants them, maybe I do." The decision didn't come with fireworks or certainty. It came with trembling hands and quiet resolve. One by one she began the process. Paperwork, home visits, endless interviews. There were questions about her income, her mental health, her ability to care for 5 growing boys alone. But she didn't back down. Every no only made her more determined. Because this wasn't about saving them, it was about becoming whole again. And one by one they came home. First was Eli, the eldest, cautious and quiet, who rarely spoke but always watched. Then came Micah, a deep thinker with solemn eyes who clutched a worn notebook everywhere he went. The twins, Jordan and Jonah, arrived next. Wild, mischievous, inseparable, turning her living room into a whirlwind of noise and broken lampshades. And finally, little Zion, barely 5, with cheeks like soft bread and a gaze that clung to hers like he'd been waiting his whole life to be held. Linda's home became a war zone of muddy shoes, spilled cereal, tangled sheets, and music blasted too loud. But for the first time in years, she didn't mind the noise. It was life. It was laughter. It was purpose. And slowly, though she was exhausted and unsure, she began to feel something stir inside her. Familiar warmth. Fierce, protective fire. A love so primal it scared her. She was no longer Linda, the childless woman with a quiet house and shattered dreams. She was becoming something more. She was becoming their mother. Love was not always soft. Sometimes it came with scraped knees, broken dishes, and slammed doors. Linda learned that quickly. The honeymoon phase of bringing the boys home faded sooner than she expected. Reality crept in through every crevice of her carefully managed optimism. Eli barely spoke to her. He sat on the porch most evenings, staring at the sky like he was waiting for someone else to come get him. Micah flinched when she raised her voice, even gently, his small body tensing as though he expected pain to follow. The twins, Jordan and Jonah, were whirlwinds of energy and mischief, stealing food from the kitchen at night and hiding it under their beds. And Zion, sweet Zion, would sometimes wake up screaming, tears soaking his pillow, clutching at air with trembling fingers, calling for a mother who no longer existed. There were days Linda questioned everything. She wasn't ready for this. 5 trauma-scarred children, their wounds invisible but deep. She had no experience with this kind of pain. Love, she discovered, wasn't always enough. Not the kind she had known, anyway. It had to be patient, tough, relentless. It had to survive rejection and endure silence. It had to fight for a space in hearts that had learned not to trust too easily. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult week where Jonah bit a teacher, Zion wet the bed 3 nights in a row, and Eli skipped school without telling anyone, Linda locked herself in the bathroom, sank to the cold tile floor, and cried until she thought her ribs would crack. She didn't want to give up, but she was so tired, so scared she was failing them, so afraid she'd never be enough. But then she heard it, faint, muffled through the door. Knock. And then a whisper. "Mom." It was Micah. Her breath caught. The word hit her like lightning. No one had said it before. Not out loud. They had called her Miss Linda, or just, hey. That single word, small and trembling, shattered something in her and began to rebuild it at the same time. She wiped her face, opened the door, and saw him standing there, holding his notebook, clutching it like a lifeline. He didn't speak again, just leaned into her, his thin arms wrapping around her waist. She held him, not saying a word, letting her tears fall silently into his hair. From that moment something shifted. It wasn't magic. It didn't solve everything, but it cracked the walls. Slowly, day by day, they began to trust her. Eli started joining her on grocery runs. The twins stopped hiding food and started leaving her little drawings, crude stick figures with messy hearts. Zion began to sleep through the night more often. And Micah. He started writing poetry in that little notebook, letting his grief bleed out through words he was too scared to say. There were still battles, tantrums, school suspensions, therapy sessions that left everyone drained. But through it all, Linda stayed. Not because it was easy, but because they were hers. These boys, who once looked at her with hollow eyes, now met her with flickers of light, with questions about tomorrow, with laughter that sometimes surprised even themselves. She wasn't perfect. There were still days she cried behind closed doors. But the love she gave wasn't fragile anymore. Had roots, deep ones, grown through hardship, fed by fierce devotion. One night, months later, as they all sat together on the porch watching fireflies blink across the yard, Jordan leaned against her and whispered, "You're the best mom we ever had." She smiled, kissed the top of his head and whispered back, "You're the only boys I ever wanted." And in that moment, under the stars, surrounded by mismatched pajamas and sticky fingers holding half-eaten popsicles, Linda finally understood. Love wasn't about blood or birth. It was about staying. About showing up again and again, even when you're tired, even when it hurts. And she was here to stay, no matter how hard the road became. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. The kind of day that began with mismatched socks, cereal spilled on the kitchen floor, and Zion refusing to wear a jacket even though the air still held the chill of spring. Nothing about that morning warned Linda that her world was about to tilt in the most extraordinary way. She was folding laundry when the doorbell rang, a sharp chime that seemed to echo louder than usual. She wiped her hands on her jeans and opened the door to find a man standing on her porch, holding a large envelope and a nervous smile. "Are you Linda Matthews?" he asked. She nodded slowly. He handed her the envelope. "I've been asked to deliver this to you in person." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away. She stood there, staring at the thick envelope in her hands, her fingers suddenly unsteady. Inside, she found a letter written on expensive stationery, embossed with the name of a law firm she didn't recognize. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines, and then she sank onto the nearest chair. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. It was from a woman named Caroline, someone Linda had never met, but whose name would become a turning point in her life. Caroline had passed away 2 months earlier after a long illness. She had been following Linda's story from afar, learning about her through community news articles, social media posts, and the foster system that had once briefly cared for her own son. Her son. That was the word that made Linda's hands tremble. Caroline had one child, Noah, a 6-year-old boy with gentle eyes and a rare immune condition. She had no family left, and in the final stages of her illness, she had made a decision that stunned the team of lawyers, doctors, and caseworkers involved. She wanted Linda to be Noah's mother. She had seen something in Linda's story, something in the way she fought for her boys, the way she loved them without boundaries. She believed Noah deserved a mother like that, even if they had never met. Linda dropped the letter, tears spilling down her cheeks. Felt impossible, absurd, beautiful, terrifying. She already had 5 boys, each one with their own needs and heartbreaks. Her days were full, her nights even fuller. She barely had time to breathe some days. But as she looked at the photo tucked inside the letter, a boy with honey-brown curls and a shy half-smile, she felt something inside her shift. Not in her head, in her heart. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table in silence, staring at the photo. Micah wandered in, rubbing his eyes, and curled into her lap like he used to when the nightmares were still frequent. He looked at the photo, then looked up at her. "Is he gonna be our brother?" Linda's voice caught. "I don't know yet." Micah nodded, thoughtful. "He looks scared. Like I used to." She kissed the top of his head, and in that small moment, the answer she'd been searching for found her. Yes, she would make room. Yes, she would fight again, for another child who had been left behind. Yes, even though her heart felt stretched thin, it had never broken, it had only grown wider. A month later, Noah arrived. Pale, quiet, and clutching a stuffed tiger with one missing eye. He didn't speak much those first few days, but he followed Linda everywhere, like a shadow too scared to lose the light. The other boys were unsure at first, especially Eli, but slowly they made space for him, the way kids often do when given time and patience. It wasn't seamless. Nothing ever was. Noah had medical needs that kept Linda up many nights, studying side effects and emergency protocols. But he also had a laugh that sounded like sunlight and a way of holding her hand that made her feel like she was holding the world. And one day, just before bedtime, he whispered in her ear, "You're my favorite miracle." Linda didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed up, and all she could do was hold him tighter. Because somehow, through grief and grit, through open doors and sleepless nights, she had become someone's miracle. Not just one someone, 6. And in return they had become hers. Every single one. The years passed in a quiet storm of chaos and grace. The house was never truly silent, not with 6 boys who grew like weeds and laughed like thunder, but there was something sacred in the noise, in the messy, beautiful tangle of life they created together. Linda bore the wear of those years like a crown. The fine lines deepened around her eyes, not from sorrow, but from smiling too much, worrying too hard, loving too fiercely. Time was not kind to her body, but it was generous with her spirit. She moved slower now, her joints stiff in the morning, her hands permanently calloused from years of cooking, mending, carrying, comforting. But even as her body began to ache with the weight of age and years of sacrifice, her eyes never lost that quiet fire, that resilient light that had once stared down a judge, a social worker, and a world that told her she wasn't enough. Linda had never asked for recognition. She had never wanted applause. She didn't do it for the praise or the headlines. She did it because the alternative, turning away, had never once crossed her heart. But sometimes love leaves a legacy so undeniable, the world cannot help but stand up and take notice. It began with Zion, the one who had once refused jackets and rules and tenderness. He had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered young man, all grit and golden loyalty. On the day of his college graduation, something Linda once thought none of her boys would even dream of. He stood at the podium, his voice steady, his hands shaking. "I wouldn't be here," he said, "if not for a woman who gave me a reason to believe I mattered. She fed me when I didn't know how to ask for food. She listened when I only knew how to scream. She taught me that love doesn't leave, even when you do your worst to push it away." There wasn't a dry eye in the audience, and somewhere in the middle row, Linda covered her face with her trembling hands, trying to hide her sobs behind a crumpled tissue. But it didn't stop there. Each of her sons, one by one, in their own time and way, began to tell their stories. Micah wrote a book. Noah painted portraits. Eli became a therapist for kids who had lived through the same kind of fear he once wore like a second skin. The world began to see what Linda had built, not with wealth or privilege, but with bare hands and relentless love. Family. Safe haven. A quiet revolution in the heart of an old neighborhood. Then came the award. Linda almost didn't attend the ceremony, brushing it off as something for people who've done important things. But her boys wouldn't hear of it. They bought her a new dress, soft blue cotton, her favorite, and made her sit still while they did her hair. She rolled her eyes through the whole process, muttering about how much laundry was piling up at home. The stage lights made her squint, and when they called her name, she hesitated. For a moment, the weight of the years nearly held her back. But then she saw them, her 6 sons, standing in the front row, clapping so hard their hands turned red, eyes wide with awe and pride. She walked to the stage slowly, every step echoing with memories of sleepless nights, scraped knees, therapy appointments, courtrooms, lullabies, and whispered prayers in the dark. The plaque was heavy in her hands, but not as heavy as the love it represented. As she looked out over the crowd, she didn't see strangers. She saw the ghosts of who they used to be. Small, broken, angry, frightened, and who they had become because someone refused to give up on them. She leaned into the microphone, her voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't save them," she said. "They saved me. Every single day. Loving them taught me how to live without fear, to hope without guarantees, to give without expecting anything back. If there's any honor here tonight, it belongs to them, for trusting me with their shattered pieces and letting me help put them back together." The room erupted in applause, but Linda heard only one thing, the voices of her sons calling out, "We love you, Mom!" All at once, over the crowd, over the lights, over the world. And in that moment, Linda finally allowed herself to believe what they had known all along. She was not just a mother. She was theirs. And she had been extraordinary,